Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Monroe Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 249 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. This is it. Can you believe it? The final leg of our 737-mile or 1,186-kilometer road trip. We've really revisited some amazing places over the last 3 weeks. The Chateau de Ramsay in Montreal, the Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site in Fort Hunter, New York, and the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And in just another 115 miles, we'll be back in Charlottesville, Virginia, where we'll revisit with Sarah Bon Harper and James Monroe's Highland estate. Now, as we drive, you might consider playing episodes 117, 131, and 193, because these episodes would help you prepare for a stop at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. And as we're already going to be in Charlottesville, why not stop at Jefferson's Monticello? Now, in episodes 117 and 131, Annette Gordon-Reed and Frank Cogliano will take you through different aspects of Thomas Jefferson's life, while in episode 193, Sarah Giorgini and Barbara Oberg will help you investigate Jefferson's on-again, off-again relationship with John Adams. Plus, collectively, these episodes are a lot of fun, and they'll help make these last 115 miles fly on by. Boy, James Monroe's Highland really is in beautiful country. Do you remember our first visit in episode 103? We spoke with its executive director, Sarah Bon Harper. She's an archaeologist by training, and she and her team use this process called dendrochronology to reveal new and fascinating information about the estate. Plus, we learned a lot about the fourth president of the United States too, so it was a really fun conversation. Whoa, look at that! We're already here! I know, we've been having fun on this road trip, and this is our last stop together. Only, it isn't really our last stop. I designed this road trip both as a journey you could embark on in real life, and as a journey that would take us to the site of our 250th episode. So if you want to continue on the road, you can, because next week we'll still be in Virginia with an all-new episode set just 127 miles away to the southeast in Jamestown. I'm really excited we'll have the opportunity to visit Jamestown. It's a fascinating place. It's also a place where we can explore the two events at the center of Virginia's 1619 commemorations: the creation of the first representative assembly and the arrival of the first Africans in English North America. Okay, I'll see you next week for an all-new episode 250, and in the meantime, I really hope you've enjoyed this road trip, and I hope you enjoy revisiting with Sarah Bon Harper at James Monroe's Highland. Today we explore the life of this fourth Virginian president with Sarah Bon Harper, Executive Director of James Monroe's Highland, the 535-acre farm and home of James Monroe. She has extensive archaeological experience, having worked as the archaeological research manager at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello prior to coming to Monroe's Highland. Today, she joins us to explore both the life and estate of the fifth president of the United States, James Monroe. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Sarah Bon Harper.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
As you may know, James Monroe was the fifth president of the United States and the last in the so-called Virginia dynasty, the period where 4 out of the 5 first presidents hailed from Virginia. Yet, Monroe does not seem to be as well known as Washington, Jefferson, or Madison. Sarah, would you provide us with an overview of Monroe's life and accomplishments?
James Monroe is an interesting historical figure where his life included a very important part of U.S. history, and his public life spanned about 50 years. And so his story tells the tale of the developing United States from the American Revolution all the way to his death in 1831, which was a big and important part of U.S. history where the United States first won its independence, struggled to establish a democratic government, government and then worked hard at making that government, that new democracy, work over a period of decades where they were challenged by both domestic issues of unity and common purpose and foreign affairs, including other world powers struggling to sort of make room for the United States in a new world and to establish ongoing relationships. And Monroe, of course, is known as being the fifth president, but he had a long political career before that where he served at the state and national level in numerous political offices. He was governor of Virginia, for example. He served in Congress. He was a senator from Virginia. He served as Secretary of State and for a brief period simultaneously as Secretary of War during the War of 1812. And so by the time he became president, he was very well qualified and had a deep perspective both on the United States and international affairs.
It really seems like Monroe started to get his deep understanding of the United States and its international affairs when he enlisted in the 3rd Virginia Infantry Unit of the Continental Army in 1776. Would you tell us about Monroe's service in the War for Independence?
I think you're very right. He did begin to get his perspective early on. He was a teenager when he was swept off into the American Revolution. He had been a student at William and Mary. He went there after his parents' death. He grew up in Westmoreland County in Virginia. He's sort of a country boy, but schooled at one of the better schools, Archibald Campbell's Campbelltown Academy. He went there as a boy, and then when his parents died, he was 16, and his uncle took charge of his education and sent him off to William and Mary, where he studied for a couple years. But I think the distractions of the American Revolution were pretty big in Williamsburg at the time, and he went off to fight. So that was 1776, and Monroe went on then to fight in some of the significant battles and events of the Northeast and fought and was severely wounded at Trenton, wintered at Valley Forge, fought at Monmouth, for example. And in addition to the heroic moment, he was commended for conspicuous bravery at Trenton. I think the other piece is that he came in contact with the circle of founders where really these folks were committed to imagining and then implementing what a new nation might look like. He was, of course, close with General George Washington at the time, was in the same circle as Lafayette and Hamilton, for example. And so he was really in there in the mix, sharing thoughts and sharing commitment. And I believe that that time in the Revolution really solidified his commitment that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Can I tell you a story about the Battle of Trenton?
Yes, please do.
I think most listeners know that the Battle of Trenton was a surprise attack at Christmas time, and the Hessian soldiers were, sort of thinking they would have a time to celebrate and relax and so forth. And Monroe went over as the advance guard the night before, and apparently a local landowner who turned out to be a man named Dr. Riker came out and said to this advance guard, "Go on, Hessian soldiers, get out of my area." And Monroe and his men said, "Oh, we're not the Hessian soldiers, we're the good guys." And Dr. Riker then said, "Well, come in and I'll feed you. And not only that, but I think I'll go with you tomorrow because I'm a surgeon and some poor soul might need me on the field of battle." And of course, we know now that that poor soul turned out to be none other than James Monroe himself. There were very few casualties at Trenton, but Monroe was wounded, a bullet to the shoulder where it nicked an artery that he would have died from that injury had Dr. Riker not been there and acted quickly. So there's a moment there that kind of exemplifies some of the variables of wartime and of the fighting that went on during the Revolution.
Monroe served in the Continental Army for 4 years. In 1780, he returned to Virginia to study law with Governor Thomas Jefferson. Sarah, what was it like for Monroe to study law with Thomas Jefferson? Did Jefferson play a big role in Monroe's life?
Thomas Jefferson played an important role in Monroe's life, and the first moment of Monroe returning to civilian life and deciding whether to resume his studies at William and Mary or to go on to what they called read the law with then Governor Jefferson was an important turning point. And Monroe debated whether to return and study at William and Mary or whether the idea of studying with Governor Jefferson was the more forward-thinking route. And again, with his uncle Joseph Jones, who who was closely involved in Monroe's life and education, he said, what should I do? And they debated it. And he went on and decided that really the way of the new republic and the ways of the new government and law were going to be best seen by Thomas Jefferson. And I think this was a great choice because what transformed Monroe from being maybe a state level lawyer or even statesman at that level to being a national figure with international perspective was both his education and the contacts within that realm of government. And Jefferson certainly exemplifies that, and his personal interest and professional mentoring of Monroe. We can look back and see that as a really critical piece in Monroe's life. Of course, it transformed Monroe's professional life, and it also eventually is the piece that landed Monroe in Albemarle County, where he owned a couple of properties, including the one Highland that I work at.
It seems like Jefferson must have provided Monroe with great training, because during his life, he would serve the United States as minister to France, England, and Spain. Mm-hmm. Would you tell us about Monroe's diplomatic service and what he accomplished on behalf of the United States in those roles?
And some of those really represent hard times that were something of a struggle for Monroe, as they would have been for anybody in those positions. Let's think about the first ministry to France, where Monroe went during the Washington administration. And this was during the French Revolution. And the United States was really on the horns of a dilemma that would remain for a couple of decades, where the power struggles between England and France were really formative in international affairs at the time. And so Monroe went to France and kind of proclaimed America's love for France and the French. And at the same time, of course, there was a minister to Britain doing similar things. And the Washington administration ended up having to somewhat dial back on that because the idea of neutrality or Britain-favored policies was at odds with what Monroe was accomplishing there in France. So, there's a couple takes on that. One is that Monroe was working a little bit outside of the administration and that he didn't have full knowledge of what was going on in the negotiations with Britain at the time. And the other is that perhaps Monroe took domestic politics away with him and let them influence his time there in France. So when he came back, Monroe was actually recalled, and he came back and he was really kind of bruised from the experience. Even though he'd accomplished some significant things, he did not end up in a good place immediately after that. And one of the big pieces is resilience, that we see Monroe then picking himself up and saying, okay, I'm going to move on and still find ways to contribute and be successful in this new government. So it's an interesting period and an interesting way of considering Monroe's formative political career.
And one of the big deals that Monroe negotiated as foreign minister was the Louisiana Purchase in 1804, right?
That's right. Monroe went, of course, not at the beginning, but sort of in the middle of things under President Jefferson, and Livingston was already there and negotiating. And again, it's another case where the United States is having to wade through the power struggles of mature European nations, this time Spain and France, and figuring out who's going to control what territories in North America. And Monroe was able to then complete the negotiation, and of course, as we know, acquire from Napoleon the large landmass that we know as the Louisiana Purchase. And Monroe was very westward oriented. He did own lands in the West in Kentucky. And from very early on, we see him really understanding the importance of, for example, navigation of the Mississippi, the movement of goods along the Mississippi and out through the port of New Orleans, and the rights of the people trying to extract goods and really make a go of westward settlement. And so it's one of the places that we see Monroe committed to westward expansion and perhaps even understanding from very early on the eventual continental proportions of the United States. So the Louisiana Purchase is a fascinating part of Monroe's story, and of course the story of the United States, because that wasn't really his charge at the beginning. He was charged with negotiating for the port of New Orleans, ended up acquiring this huge landmass. Interesting to imagine, had that not happened, what France and Spain would have done instead and what the United States would be today.
I'd like for us to explore Monroe's presidency, but before we go there, it seems like between the time the United States won its independence in 1783 and at least until the end of the War of 1812, all presidents sided with one of the major European powers, and Monroe served as minister to the Big Three, Great Britain, France, and Spain. Did Monroe develop a preference for any of the European powers during his service as minister? Did he lean towards Great Britain like Washington and Adams, or towards France like Jefferson and Madison?
No, I would put Monroe in the category of Jefferson and being somewhat of a Francophile and being more attuned in that direction. Monroe, of course, spoke French and did conduct at least some, if not all, of his own negotiations in French, and really seemed committed to France and French relations. It was only later on that he became more pro-British, because that was a later point in his life when he was minister there. And yes, you definitely see that alignment where we see in general the Republican faction being aligned with French and the Federalists more aligned with Britain. So we certainly see him, especially early on in his career, as more pro-French and certainly vehemently and strongly partisan in the early years towards the Republican Party.
It kind of sounds like Monroe leaned French, then appreciated the British point of view, so that by the time he became president, he was a bit more balanced in his viewpoints. Now that we know about his European political leanings, would you tell us about Monroe's presidency between 1817 and 1825?
By queuing that up, I think you've also put your finger on one of the most important pieces of Monroe's story that make it incredibly relevant for today, where, we see this strongly and stridently flag-waving partisan Monroe in the early years, especially in the 1790s, and we see him just strongly pro-Republican and anti-Federalist. And then by the time he's president, he really came in with a sense of national unity that downplayed partisanship and kind of reduced the Federalist Party by absorbing some of those platforms. And I think it probably was the War of 1812 and seeing how a stronger national government was important, or some of the Federalist platforms, such as a standing military and a national bank. These really could play into national strength and security that made him more inclusive. And so by the time he was elected as a somewhat unifying and more inclusive president. The era of good feelings is often applied from the end of the Madison administration and into Monroe's presidency. And that sounds very rosy, and there were certainly good things about it, but it also in somewhat masks some partisanship or division within Monroe's own administration among members of the Republican Party. And it disregards also the economic collapse of 1819, the Panic of 1819, which lasted a couple of years, was a major negative economic affair. And somehow Monroe managed to get through that, and it didn't tarnish his reputation at all. But that was a major sort of market correction, as we would say now, or they referred to it as hard times, which has a delightful understatement to it. So there was good and bad during Monroe's administration. There was this sense of national unity in that he embraced enough of the Federalist platform to make him inclusive. And then there was also some economic hard times. Of course, the market had been going gangbusters over cotton and land in the South and the southwestern frontier. And then the collapse, of course, was hard for many people at the time. So, there were accomplishments and there was a sense of national unity, which I think brings a certain appeal to us today. And then there was also some economic difficulty. But Monroe was tremendously popular as president. He was elected nearly unanimously, and people were very fond of him. He went on these public tours where he spoke and visited many towns and cities and spoke publicly and met people. Of course, in the time before television, this is the way that he reached out to people, and this was very, very popular.
History and historians have often defined presidents by a few key pieces of legislation, or perhaps by an important treaty or program. What key pieces of legislation, treaty, or program define James Monroe's presidency?
Well, not a treaty so much, but a statement. Of course, we really know the Monroe Doctrine, and we see our visitors, for example, at Highland, if they're going to know one thing about James Monroe, it's the Monroe Doctrine. So note to all rising politicians out there, make sure your name is on something if you want to be known for it. And of course, that's anachronistic because the name Monroe Doctrine didn't come about until about 1850. But the statement really, which was in part of his State of the Union address, or what they said then, his message message to Congress, really closed the New World to colonization by existing European powers. Following a string of revolutions in the Americas and independence and really kind of the quest for sovereignty by those nations, Monroe said, okay, this is off limits. And of course, we also sometimes forget the second part of that, which is in terms of the United States, we'll stay out of other national affairs, out of your business, unless it is absolutely necessary. And so really, if we looked at this along the trajectory of Monroe's career, we see this understanding of the vying for power of these mature European nations, England, France, and Spain primarily, and how so much of the early decades of the United States foreign policy and international affairs were shaped by these countries trying to get economic and political dominance in the ways that they could. And so this statement that became known as the Monroe Doctrine, certainly had an influence, as we know, from Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, but certainly also reflects the evolution of Monroe's thinking and a mature statement of this long career in foreign affairs, where he understood how each of those other countries was trying to amass their power and influence in economic and political ways.
Now that we've had a whirlwind tour of Monroe's public life and service, let's take a tour of his private life. Sarah, would you tell us about Monroe's estate, Highland?
Yeah, absolutely. This is an interesting question, of course, because we have recently made new discoveries that change how we understand Highland. But Monroe moved to Albemarle County, which is really kind of in the center of the state. It's just east of the Blue Ridge, and it's west of Richmond, Virginia, the capital, which is more or less in the center of the state. Monroe moved to Albemarle County at the urging of his friend and mentor, Thomas Jefferson, where Jefferson really wanted his political allies and personal friends to be close to him. And so first, Monroe purchased a property in what's now Charlottesville at the University of Virginia. We call it now Monroe Hill. And he farmed there for a while. And then in 1793, purchased what we now know as Highland from Champ and Maria Carter. The initial purchase was 1,000 acres, and it grew to 3,500 acres. The farmland was said to be better, and it was larger, and it was adjoining to Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. So it was a farm with plowed fields. He had grains and some tobacco, and he had orchards and well-timbered hill slopes. It goes way up to a ridge where there were certainly logs and that fed the sawmill on the property. So he farmed there and owned the property for some decades, and then simultaneously and eventually later owned a larger property with a grand house called Oak Hill that's in Loudoun County, Virginia, much closer to Washington, D.C., and that became his last home that he owned and he built.
You alluded to this, but would you tell us about the dendrochronology study you conducted in April 2016 and about the really surprising information it revealed about Monroe's Highland estate?
The announcement that we made, the conclusion that we were able to draw this year, came from multiple lines of evidence. Dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, is the linchpin that holds this story together. And tree ring dating is a way of dating standing structures, in this case buildings, from an established sequence of tree rings, where the scientists, the dendrochronologists, are able to establish a sequence of tree ring widths for a region. And so going way back, we know the sequence of tree growth patterns for many centuries. And so when you take a sample from the wood from your house or your building, you can then match that up to the growth sequence that you've established for the region. It's a statistical match, and it can get very close, right down to, say, even the season of the year if you have a good sample. And so the dendrochronology or tree ring dating that we did at Highland was a part of a multidisciplinary research effort that included archaeology, architectural history, and then finally this piece of scientific dating. The house that is standing at Highland has long been considered to be one wing of a formerly two-wing building. And it was thought that these two wings, these sort of two rectangular blocks that we see on the insurance documents, were Monroe's original house, and that one of the two wings, the larger one, was destroyed by fire. And we see as early as 1885, accounts in a newspaper, for example, that this is the smaller of the two wings of Monroe's house, the other wing having been destroyed by fire. And so that's been the story for a long time. And people have wondered about it because it's a very small, the original piece is a 2-room house with a 2-room basement underneath. And that's a small and modest piece, even as a wing of a larger house. And so William and Mary conducted some good research about 40 years ago when the property passed from private hands into their ownership and really investigated carefully. And all the evidence pointed to, it is what it says it is. All the experts, both doing documentary studies and archaeology and architectural history, they all said, it is what it says it is. And, here's where you'd look if you wanted to look more. And the point was we had never really found that other wing, right? The one that was said to have been destroyed. And so I had enough questions when I started there in 2012 that I couldn't quite answer to my own satisfaction. And so drawing from my research background, started doing archaeological survey around the property to say, okay, let's find out for sure where that other wing was. We want to be absolutely certain we understand this place. And so at the same time, started doing an architectural study, and the experts noted to me that there were enough elements of the standing house, including the patterns of brickwork, the hinges, and the moldings on the interior, that it really would be beneficial to bring in dendrochronology. And so we got that rolling, and it's a long cycle of research and lab work to get the results, and also came up in the archaeology with some architectural debris in front of the later 1870s house. And so we continued exploring that architectural debris, and it turns out there were very well preserved foundations right beneath the ground surface. And so we first identified those in April of 2015 and thought that they were part of the missing wing, or at least used that as the standing hypothesis to test against. And then when we got the dendrochronology results back, and the date from that first period, the latest harvest of the wood, was spring of 1818, we knew that we had to change our understanding and conclude that this must have been the house that Monroe had constructed in 1818 that he called his house for lodgers, which was a presidential guest house. So this completely revises our understanding of Monroe's main residence, and now we have a much larger house, archaeologically preserved, that we will explore, and it allows us an opportunity to really re-examine Monroe and his worldview. Of course, one's house is an expression of ambition, perhaps, both personal and maybe political. It's an economic statement. It's a statement of style. And the small, what we thought was the remaining wing, has really played into an understanding of Monroe as humble and perhaps unassuming, living modestly, where this may not be the case at all. And it's time to re-examine Monroe and his political ambitions through understanding the house and the property.
Bill would like to know how the discovery of Monroe's lost house has changed and challenged your interpretation of Monroe and his estate. You addressed a bit of this in your previous answer, but specifically, Bill would like to know if you could tell us about 2 or 3 things you've had to change in your public tour of the estate as a result of this new information.
It has been transformative, and the changes will still roll out for the next bunch of years as we completely reinterpret. Most fundamentally, we have changed our discussion from, this is a wing of Monroe's main house, to this is a house that Monroe built during his presidency to house his entourage or visitors when he came here as president, and of course could no longer just slip away, but had to have a lot of people with him. Our visitor experience has changed significantly. At the moment, we are offering not a house tour as such, but more of a site tour where the expert guide meets the visitor in a different location, not at the house, takes in the location of the archaeological remains. At the moment, they're covered because we're between excavation seasons, but talks in that area with some visuals about the excavation and the discovery, and then tours the standing structure. And the standing structure still has houses that great collection of Monroe family pieces. We have about 70 or 80% of our collection belonged to the Monroes originally. So we are able to use that material culture to interpret the Monroe family and political life. So that part, for the moment, has remained the same. But the experience, I think, is more of the site rather than of this particular house. So those are really the big ones. And in the future, I hope that we will be able to significantly recurate these spaces and make them some dynamic and interactive exploration of Monroe and his political career, and through that, the story of the early United States.
Earlier in our conversation, we discussed how Monroe had benefited from a really good education. And now we've explored a little of Highland, which was his 535-acre farm. It kind of sounds like Monroe had money. Was he a slaveholder?
Yes, Monroe was a slaveholder, and the farm eventually at Highland grew to be 3,500 acres, and so that's a really large plantation. And he did own slaves at Highland and at Oak Hill, Loudoun County. And he owned at any given time at Highland between, say, 20 and 50 was kind of an average number during his time at Highland. And they were primarily field hands because the plantation was a working farm really for economic purposes, right? So farming, so various kinds of agriculture and timbering, as I mentioned. And of course, while the Monroes were there, also enslaved domestic servants who waited on the family and prepared food and took care of their needs in that way. We know some names and some life stories, and we're just unraveling more and trying to learn more about these families and, in fact, the descendants that are still around today. And so the story of slavery is one that we are paying close attention to, both archaeologically. We're exploring a site where we think there may have been a slave quarter and trying to find the footprint of that. And we have a new brochure that was produced this year together with some help from the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. And in that brochure and in our spoken programs that we give on site, one of the most important things for me and my direction at Highland is to talk about the lives of enslaved people as individuals within the larger economic and political systems, the same way that we do James Monroe. So instead of talking about Monroe as a political figure and these important events like the War of 1812, the Panic of 1819, these things, and then in contrast, talking about slaves as the people hoeing the fields and sort of making the food or washing the clothing, we need to talk about the enslaved people in the same set of conversations that we use for Monroe. So if we're talking about Monroe's political and historical significance, we're also going to talk about the political and historical significance of these enslaved people right from the very basics of their lives at Highland. For example, in the 18-teens, when the cotton boom was going and the much deeper South was the locus of all growth and economic activity, enslaved people in the upper South had a very unstable and uncertain future where they could very well be sold south, where slaves were much more in demand for farming than they were in places like Piedmont, Virginia. And so we talk about how that formed the backdrop of their lives and, in fact, even what they were doing in their daily lives. So it's important to me to include slaves in the same set of narratives about the trajectory of American history and the way individual lives were enmeshed in history, rather than talking about a historical biography. And I recognize the importance of biography for understanding people. And so we do as much as we can to expound on family relationships and individual choices, but always in the same context that we talk about Monroe and politics and economics.
Thank you for telling us about how historians and interpreters at Highland interpret the lives of Monroe's slaves. For years, historic sites, museums, colleges, and even book-writing historians largely downplayed or ignored the important role slaves played. And in recent years, historic sites, museums, colleges, and book-writing historians have really worked to try and give slaves their due. And it sounds like you have many programs at Highland that try and give slaves their due.
Yes, very much so. And this is important both for historical perspective and in today's world. Of course, talking about history without talking about slavery would be impossible. And also, it's relevant in today's world because of really the history of race relations in the United States. And so our spoken interpretation of slavery is new. We try to first incorporate the discussion of slavery in most of our conversations, or all of them where we can. Within the site tour, we discuss slavery and where enslaved people lived and worked and so forth. And then we have another program simply called Slavery at Highland. That's something of a drop-in program and a question and answer where our well-trained staff discuss individual names and individual life stories and roles on the plantation and the role of slavery on plantations at the time. And so for several hours a day, several days a week, we have that program where people can come and explore and ask questions and really try to deepen their understanding of the role that race and slavery played in the development of the United States.
It sounds like you have a lot of interpretive challenges at Highland. You have the Lost House, so you're doing site tours instead of house tours, and you're reintegrating slavery into the narrative of James Monroe and his estate. Are there any other unique interpretive challenges that you face at Highland because you are trying to interpret and convey information about the life of a United States president?
Studying a United States president is interesting because we risk becoming too focused on the one particular individual. And it's certain that the reason Highland is preserved and the reason that it's a historic site now is because of the importance of James Monroe and his role in U.S. history. But there was so much more there than James Monroe. So always making that balance between our focus on Monroe and our focus on his larger context is a tricky one, and one that I hope that we get right at least part of the time. We talk about it on site as moving from maybe a portrait view of Monroe, if you can picture sort of on the wall in a rectangular frame, a painting or portrait of Monroe, to going to the Google Street View of Monroe, right? Where if you're walking through history and looking all around and trying to understand Monroe's context, that's really the picture we're trying to paint so that we can understand the founding era and understand the struggles of those decades of establishment and then growth and preservation of the young United States in a deeper and kind of three-dimensional way. And so that's really where we're trying to walk in interpreting history at Highland, which is so dominated by a significant U.S. president and one who we're ready to have him step out of the shadows and be fully understood. But we don't want to risk abandoning all the others who are also a part of the story.
Earlier, you noted that you like the term hard times because it's so wonderfully understated. And throughout the course of our conversation, I can't help but think that the presidency of James Monroe might also be understated. Is there anything about James Monroe and his legacy as president and a statesman that has relevance for us in our 21st century?
Yeah, I think so. I look at Monroe's career and where he was in the 1790s and stridently partisan, where, responding to the Federalist platform just vehemently. And really, I kind of got the sense of anything the Federalists would say, Monroe would oppose. And then I look at the more inclusive platform of Monroe's own presidency and how he really worked to incorporate ideas that he felt were essential to the growth and preservation of the United States, even if they countered what the traditional Republican Party stood for. And that increase in complexity and deepening of his commitment to the United States is really relevant, I think, today, where we are, no secret, we're more polarized than ever before, and we sometimes risk party allegiance over what might be good for preservation or even improvement of the United States in lots of ways. And so maybe we should look at bipartisan or transpartisan leadership, applying those anachronistic terms and say, how can we get things done in a similar way? And how can we then, as a corollary to that, use the commitment of these founders to the the ideals of democratic governance? How can we use those ideals to engage voters or members of the community or people who maybe don't feel particularly connected, say, with the American Revolution? How can we make these ideas relevant to them, and how can we deepen their understanding of what a democracy is and should be?
You've certainly piqued our interest in James Monroe's Highland, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask before we moved into the time warp whether you have any tips that would allow us to make the most of our next visit to the estate.
I would recommend coming with the idea of spending a couple hours taking the tour, thinking about U.S. history. Some advanced reading is great, or maybe we will inspire you to do some reading while you visit us. But, plan to come and really try to soak in the experience of history and put yourself in the mind frame of that time. Of course, we're rich in presidential history in Virginia, and seeing James Madison's Montpelier and Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home right next door, make it a full and deep understanding of that time period and maybe what each of these men was thinking and was really committed to.
And for those of us who would like to do a bit of advanced reading, do you have one or two books or articles on James Monroe that you can recommend?
I would recommend a very readable and recent biography of Monroe by Harlow Unger. It's called The Last Founding Father. It's the most recent and engaging view of Monroe. And then maybe do some internet research and read the many news stories about our discoveries this year and come prepared to engage in discovery. And that's our real theme going forward, is discovery, where we will be continually revising what we understand and then what we tell the public about Monroe through our own research that's ongoing.
Let's move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Opinion, what might have happened if James Monroe had not served as president in 1820? Would the Missouri Compromise, which kept the balance of power between slave states and free states in the Senate by adding Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, have been signed into law?
That's a good question. And the Missouri crisis and the eventual Missouri Compromise is one of those moments that I think we could probably do a semester-long seminar on, because the issue of slavery was bound to be a national and divisive issue. From the very beginning, the founders knew that they were not dealing with this issue and that it would be really critical at some point. And I think Monroe's actions and the actions of the government as a whole during the Missouri crisis in 1820 and 1821 really delayed the American Civil War, and that had the compromise not been made, we probably would have seen a war at that point, maybe a little bit later, but it would have eventually landed there. And that eventual compromise that allowed Missouri to enter as a slave state and Maine as a free state, but limited slavery north of the 3630 line, that was the piece that allowed the additional 40 years before the American Revolution. And I could argue, and I think with some validity, that had the Civil War taken place 40 years earlier, the outcome could conceivably have been very different. There's a moment in national thinking from these United States are to the United States is, right? The collection of states as envisioned early on and the more united national level identity that was still emerging. And so the division around slavery was bound to happen at some point. And the Missouri Compromise is one of the pieces that allowed it to delay until a later moment when there was greater identification communication with the national government, greater infrastructure such as the railroad, allowing the movement of goods and support to troops and so forth. And these were really important features that allowed the federal government to prevail at that time. And the question of whether someone else had been president, what would have happened, is a good one that, I think that there's a lot of nuanced discussion. But just to summarize, there's a couple lines of thought on how Monroe's presidency figured into the Missouri Compromise. I think the traditional one has been he was kind of hands off, go figure it out and let me know when it's done. But then there's the other piece, particularly with work by Robert Forbes, that says Monroe was engaged in the hidden hand presidency there, where behind the scenes he was allowing people to get things done by encouragement and by behind the scenes negotiation and by not needing to claim credit, but making it happen. So, the truth in there is, no doubt in there somewhere, but it certainly would bear greater investigation. But in either case, Monroe was president during the time, and what we came out with was kicking the can down the road 40 years and eventually having a longer and more protracted civil war, certainly bloodier with more loss. And what I see from Monroe is a commitment to his core value of national unity in the Missouri Compromise. And we could argue very rightly that any agreement that perpetuated slavery for even 5 minutes was wrong and tainted, and certainly from a human rights perspective, that's the case. So no national unity is worth that. You could certainly argue that. But if you wanted to argue from within Monroe's own commitments and really what he valued at his core, he made a decision that allowed the United States to persevere for another few decades. So there was no winning in that compromise, but by Monroe's action, we see him committed to that perpetuation of the United States, even though if he hadn't done it, the outcome would have been very different.
Where is the best place to look for more information about you and how we can get in contact with you if we still have questions about James Monroe, his Highland estate, or what we can do to make the most out of our next visit to Highland?
Well, you should certainly look at highland.org, which is our website. You can find our events there and our contact information. Our main line is 434-293-8000, and general inquiries can be sent to info@highland.org.
Sarah Bonharper, thank you for giving us an overview of James Monroe's life and his estate at Highland.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest in James Monroe and our discoveries at Highland.
James Monroe was the fourth president in the Virginia dynasty that most of us knew little about. Well, except for the fact that he had that important doctrine named after him. Now we know that he served in the Continental Army and fought bravely at the Battle of Trenton in 1776, that he negotiated the Louisiana Purchase in 1804, and that he lived the life of a slaveholder in Albemarle County, Virginia, on his estate Highland. It's amazing to me that we seem to know so much about Monroe's life as president, and yet we seem to know so little about his private life at Highland. Can you believe that what we thought was part of his main house was actually his guest house? That's an incredible find, and one that the historians and interpreters are still trying to work into their interpretations of Monroe and his private life at Highland. It'll be really interesting to see what investigations of that main house foundation reveal as we go forward in time. You can find more information about James Monroe's Highland, its calendar of special events, plus all the titles of the books Sarah mentioned during our conversation on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/103. If you enjoyed this episode, would you please tell people about it? The best way for a podcast to find new listeners is by word-of-mouth recommendations, and I'd greatly appreciate yours, as I'd like to share information about our early American past with as many people as possible.